Hey, everybody, it is Professor Jenkins, and just wanted to get the week started off here with a review of what's important in week 6, our discussion and study of taxes and how they affect microeconomics. So what we're going to be looking at is how taxes impact the efficiency of the marketplace. And before I get into that, though, I want to remind everybody that there's a discussion post due this week. We're looking for an article or news story that you find somewhere that relates to something we've talked about recently: taxes, government actions in the market, efficiency and fairness of the market. So looking for those things and looking for some good discussion posts. We had some great ones last time. So let's get started. And to do that, I am going to share my screen so we can look and talk together. And I will get my pointer going so I can show you what I'm talking about. So our class site, this particular period, this week, we've got 3 objectives. And I'll sum up what you really need to focus on in this particular module, and that is understanding the mechanics of how taxes change the efficiency in the marketplace, how we go from an efficient to an inefficient market because of a tax or some type of restriction placed on the market. It could be Social Security tax, it could be income tax, or it could be just taxes in general, sales taxes, things like that. And I don't want you to confuse inefficiency with meaning right or wrong. Inefficiency is just a generic term that we're going to use whenever we talk about the markets not being in equilibrium, because the world doesn't work that way, guys. We have what we call an economics nirvana. That's a completely competitive, fair marketplace where everything is sold and bought at equilibrium price, and the quantity bought and sold is at equilibrium quantity. But in the world that we live in, the government has to impose taxes in order to support the functions of the government, and we as society agree that those functions are important. So we're not here to discuss or pass judgment on whether those taxes are right or wrong. We're here to just make sure that we understand exactly what's happening in the market when taxes are imposed. And if you decided to take a position on whether taxes are fair or are unfair, I hope that you use your understanding of economics down the road to explain your positioning. And if the world were perfect, I'd have you guys write papers about that and show me your prowess in understanding this by drawing graphs about what happens with the market fairness when inefficiencies, when there's taxes placed. So we're just going to put that aside. Again, I just want you to understand, for purposes of this class, how taxes impact the market. And in order to do that, I want to jump to the textbook, and I want to show you what I think are the key figures that you should study for the exam. Number 1 is 8.1. This shows you what happens when taxes are imposed on either the buyer or the seller in the marketplace. We go from an equilibrium to an inefficient solution, and what happens is that inefficiency causes a gap in the market between the price that the buyer or the seller sees and the price that the buyer or the seller pays. For example, in the first graph A, we have the tax being borne by the seller, or excuse me, the buyer, which means that demand will get lower, because remember, if I'm the buyer and I have to pay a tax, it looks to me like the price is higher. If I'm the seller and I have to pay the tax, it looks to me like it costs more to produce the product. And you can tell by the way the supply or the demand curve shifts. In this case, the buyer is bearing the burden of the tax. They're paying the tax, so the price looks higher, and the equilibrium shifts, and we get this box that shows how that government revenue is split. $5 is taken away from the consumer surplus, and $5 is taken away from producer surplus. Okay, so make sure you understand how these two graphs work. This is going to be important. Number two, we want to take a look at not only how the taxes are shared and how they affect the market, but we want to look at how it affects the efficiency of the market. Specifically, in this case, we can see that in figure 8.2, it shows us that when a tax is placed on a sale of a good or service, and in this case, we're using the tax on the smartphones again, and you'll notice that in this case, we're pretending that the seller bears the burden of the tax. So the supply curve shifts left, it decreases supply, and it creates in this triangle here a deadweight loss. So remember, the definition of efficiency is that the total efficiency, the total surplus is maximized. So in an efficient market, the consumer surplus and the producer surplus is shared equally, and it's maximized. But now we have the consumer surplus and the producer surplus still shared equally, but we have a loss here because there's the area of the triangle that shows what is lost in terms of surplus by the imposition of the tax. So make sure you understand this. Next, we talk about what happens when the tax is borne by the buyer or the seller, but we introduce the concept of elasticity. And elasticity of supply or demand has an impact on how much of the deadweight loss is created and how much of the surplus is lost to either the producer or the buyer. Okay, if the demand is elastic, then any tax that's imposed because the supply curve shifts, and I'm looking at this diagram 8.3, because the supply curve shifts, any tax that's imposed is borne by the producer if the demand is elastic. And conversely, if the supply is elastic, then any burden and deadweight loss is borne by the buyer. The buyer pays the entire tax, and the deadweight loss is a loss to the consumer surplus. Okay, and then lastly, we talk about income and Social Security tax. Here's an example of how income tax affects the efficiency in a market. Now you notice that the supply curve shifts because households supply the labor, so they're the suppliers of labor, and income tax is borne by the supplier because we as employees or suppliers of labor, we pay the entire tax. So what it looks like to us is, even though I'm earning $100,000 because I have to pay a tax, I'm actually only earning $90,000. Okay. So the two things that I notice about this graph that are important to point out is, number one, the shift in the supply curve doesn't create a second parallel supply curve. The slope of the supply curve changes slightly because income tax is progressive. The higher that you make, the higher income that you have, the more taxes you pay. Okay, so there's a little bit of a increase in the slope of the supply curve, but other than that, the impact is predictable. We have a deadweight loss, and part of that burden is borne by the employer, and part of it is borne, most of it, in fact, is borne by the worker. And lastly, we look at Social Security tax, and Social Security tax is really a little bit more traditional. It has the predicted income. It creates a gap between the amount paid and the amount received by workers, the amount paid by employers and the amount received by workers. And you can see that the burden is borne a little bit unequally. Most of it borne by the workers or the receivers of income, and some of it by the employer. Okay, creates a wedge, we call it a wedge between what employers pay and what employees receive. Those are the 4 key topics. All right, the rest of the chapter is about some ideas about what's efficient and fairness, and you should read those so you understand them to be a good citizen of the world. There might be a question or 2 on those, but most of the questions I think are going to come from those 4 things I just discussed. So I'm going to leave it there. If you have any questions, as normal, please let me know. And I look forward to seeing you on the other side as we move toward exam number 2. So